On Saturday, November 14th, 1998, 35-year-old Sarah Raris and her best friend Laura scanned the racks at a local clothing store in Howard County, Maryland. Sarah wasn't really looking to buy any new clothes, but she was desperate to distract herself from the horrible day she was having, and she hoped shopping might help with that. This was one of the weekends that her estranged husband, Lorenzo, had custody of their 1-year-old son, and Sarah hated every minute she was apart from her baby. Sarah and her husband were in the middle of a heated divorce and custody battle, and if she had her way, Lorenzo would actually never see their son again. Just then, Laura pointed out a shirt that she thought Sarah might actually like. It would look great with Sarah's red hair, she said. Sarah forced a smile, but deep down she knew that this retail therapy was not having the desired effect. Sarah continued to walk around the store, but she just couldn't shake herself out of her bad mood. And this frustrated her, because she'd always prided herself on being this really upbeat, positive person. In fact, up until about a year ago, Sarah's life had seemed almost perfect. She worked as a statistician for the National Security Agency, or NSA for short, helping solve a range of information security issues for multiple federal agencies. Sarah had always had a gift for mathematics, and so using her talent to help her country was like a dream job for her. Also, at the time, she had begun writing her first novel, a murder mystery about a brilliant statistician who solves crimes, and she and her husband Lorenzo had bought this beautiful house in a suburban neighborhood that looked like something out of a painting. The streets were lined with manicured lawns and white picket fences. And perhaps most importantly for Sarah, she had become a mother. But soon after her baby was born, things at home had begun to fall apart. Lorenzo didn't seem to want anything to do with helping raise the child, so Sarah quickly felt like she was juggling this important government job with taking care of a newborn baby all on her own. Also, Sarah's family lived about 1,000 miles away in Alabama, so they weren't able to help. Luckily though, her mother-in-law, so Lorenzo's mom, had pitched in and began babysitting whenever she could, and also helping Sarah with cooking and cleaning. But Sarah's mother-in-law worked full-time at a retirement home, so there was only so much she could do. And no matter how much Sarah begged Lorenzo for his help, he basically just refused. After almost a year of this, Sarah just couldn't take it anymore, so she filed for divorce. However, as soon as she did that, Lorenzo suddenly began acting like he wanted to be with their child all the time. And so he made the divorce and custody proceedings very difficult for Sarah. Back in the store, Sarah's friend Laura asked her if there was anything Sarah wanted to try on. Sarah thanked Laura for going out with her and trying to help her get her mind off of things, but at this point, she said she just wanted to go home. Laura said she totally understood, and the two friends said goodbye and headed to their cars in the parking lot. A little later that night, Sarah opened up a notebook and her laptop on a coffee table in her family room and began working on her mystery novel. Then, at around 8:45 p.m., as she was still hard at work, she suddenly heard something and looked up, startled. She held her breath, trying to be as quiet as possible, but she didn't hear anything else. Still feeling unsettled, she got up, walked down the hallway to her bedroom, and then crouched down by her bed. And there, on the floor, she saw the large metal skillet, exactly where she kept it every night. Living by herself with her baby made her nervous, so the skillet let her feel like she had a weapon close by when she went to bed. But as Sarah stayed there crouched down by her bed for a second, she didn't hear any more noise anywhere in the house, and so she shook off her nerves and decided to leave the skillet behind. She told herself she was just being paranoid. And so Sarah stood back up, walked down the hallway, and sat down in the family room, getting ready to dive back into her mystery novel. However, just moments later, she heard the sound of shattering glass. At 7:45 p.m. on the following night, Sarah's friend Laura got home after being out for most of the day. She walked into her kitchen and tossed her keys on the counter, and she noticed the light on her answering machine was blinking. And so Laura picked up her phone, hit a button to play back the message, and the automated voice on the machine told her that this message had come in the previous night at 8:56 p.m. Laura figured she must have missed the call the night before and just not noticed she had this voicemail before she went out earlier. The voicemail began to play, and at first all Laura heard was static, and she thought maybe somebody had dialed accidentally and not left a message. but suddenly she heard heavy breathing and then screaming and crying, and then the message ended. Then the automated voice gave Laura the option to dial the number of that caller back. Laura just stood there for a second, completely freaked out by what she had just heard. She snapped out of it and hit that button to automatically return the call, and when she did, it went straight to Sarah's voicemail. Laura's hands started shaking. Now that she knew it was Sarah who had left this message, it was like the urgency went through the roof. And so she hung up and tried calling her friend right back, hoping maybe this time Sarah would pick up. But again, it just rung and went to voicemail. And so Laura hung up and immediately dialed 911. A few minutes later, a Howard County police officer pulled up in front of Sarah's house. He'd been out on patrol nearby when he got the call to do a wellness check at this address. The officer got out of his car and walked towards the front door. It was dark out, but there were lights on inside the house and also out in front of the house. However, before the officer even got to the front door, he froze. He saw that one of the front windows of the house had been smashed in, and there was glass laying all over the ground under the windowsill. His first thought was that he had just stumbled upon a robbery, and so the officer quickly went to the front door and knocked, but he barely waited before trying the doorknob. When he saw it was locked, the officer quickly used a special tool to unlock it, and then he opened up the door. The officer stepped inside the house and slowly began walking around, calling out to see if anybody was home, and keeping his hand hovering above his weapon. For all he knew, the robber might still be in the house and could be armed. The officer eventually made his way into the brightly lit family room, and when he did, he looked down at the floor, and as soon as he saw what was there, he turned and ran out of the house. He got to his cruiser, fumbled for his radio, and called for backup. It was close to 9 p.m. that night when Detective Nate Rettig of the Howard County Police stepped out of his car and approached the officer who had first arrived on the scene. By now, this quiet neighborhood had come to life. Detective Rettig saw neighbors standing on their porches, staring at all the police and first responders swarming outside of Sarah's house. Rettig spoke to the responding officer who had come to the house for a wellness check. He was a young officer who now looked completely shaken by what he had seen inside of the house. Luckily, Rettig, who was more senior than this young officer, had a very fatherly demeanor about him. He was tall and still and always appeared to be in total control. He spoke in a calm voice with a Baltimore accent, and he was able to get the young officer to calm down and also give him a detailed account of what he had seen inside of the house that had shaken him so. After that, Rettig told the young officer to just stay outside, and then Rettig put on his gloves and walked to the front door. Once inside, Rettig went straight to the family room, and when he looked down at what was on the ground, it shocked him too. He'd just walked into one of the goriest crime scenes he'd ever witnessed in his many years as a homicide detective. A woman who looked like she was in her 30s was covered in blood, and there was blood spatter all over the walls and the floor. But that wasn't all. The woman had clearly been hacked and stabbed at with a blade so violently and so many times that her head had nearly been decapitated and her hands were barely connected to her wrists. Rettig's first thought was that this had to have been a rage-filled overkill. I mean, several of the wounds he was looking at that had been inflicted on this woman individually should have been enough to kill her. But she had several of those fatal-seeming wounds. Also, a scene this brutal typically meant investigators were dealing with a crime of passion. Detective Rettig saw a purse sitting on the nearby coffee table. He looked inside of it and found a wallet with a driver's license inside. Despite all of the blood, he could still match the victim to the woman on this ID. The victim was Sarah Raris. Rettig knelt back down to get a better look at Sarah. He saw all the blood on her clothes and skin, and the blood on the walls and the floor had all dried. And Rettig knew that the woman who had called police to do the wellness check said she'd gotten a frightening voicemail from the victim, from Sarah, the night before. So it seemed logical to him, especially based on the dried nature of the blood, that Sarah had already been dead for 24 hours or so. Rettig stood up, walked back outside, and joined several forensics technicians and police officers who had also just arrived at the scene. He told the officers to start by talking to the neighbors, many of whom were still standing around and watching from their porches, to see if any of them had seen anything strange or heard anything strange the night before. Rettig hoped in a quiet neighborhood like this that maybe somebody heard the sound of that window shattering and came outside to take a look. Maybe they saw something. As the forensics team entered Sarah's house and began searching for prints and DNA samples, Rettig also went back inside and began a full walkthrough of the house. And as he did that, he noticed that somebody had clearly ransacked the place. But Rettig immediately thought this was all just staged to look like a robbery. It looked like a VCR had been pulled off its stand and stolen, there were VHS tapes littered all across the family room floor, and the kitchen drawers had all been pulled open. But Sarah's purse with cash and credit cards in it had been left behind on the coffee table, and so too had her jewelry and laptop, which were worth way more than a VCR. And so Rettig did not think this looked like a robbery gone bad. Also, just the brutality of the murder itself backed up his theory. As far as he was concerned, there was no way Sarah had been killed just by some random burglar. After searching the house for well over an hour, Rettig reconvened with the rest of the team. Forensics technicians had found bloody handprints on the wall, but those just indicated that the killer had been wearing gloves. But they did find several bloody footprints leading from the family room to the broken window and into the front yard. They would use these prints and the blood on the body, walls, and the floor to see if they could get any DNA samples that might belong to the killer. The officers who had been out canvassing the neighborhood said that unfortunately, nobody had seen or heard anything strange the night before. In fact, nobody had even noticed the shattered window at Sarah's house until the police arrived. This surprised Detective Rettig. This was not a neighborhood that experienced much crime at all, and so he really hoped that somebody had heard that broken glass and maybe thought there was a break-in going on and went out to investigate, but clearly not. But even still, the forensics team had plenty of samples for testing, and because of the brutal, sort of rage-filled nature of the crime, Rettig felt like he could start narrowing down potential suspects to only people who had a close, intimate relationship with their victim, Sarah. Rettig also knew there was another huge piece of evidence that was not in the house, the voicemail message that her friend Laura got that might have recorded her murder. As late night turned into early morning, Detective Rettig arrived at Sarah's friend Laura's house. Laura was still wide awake, desperately waiting to hear any news about Sarah. And so when she saw Rettig, she led him into her house and brought him into the front room, and when they got there, Rettig just told her she should sit down. Laura sat down on the couch and began shaking her head. It was like she already knew what was coming. Rettig told her that he was so sorry, but police had found her friend Sarah dead inside of her home, and she had clearly been murdered. Even though Laura by this point had sort of been expecting the worst, she refused to accept this at first. She said there was no way Sarah was gone. It had to be a mistake. Rettig watched Laura completely break down on the couch, sobbing and just repeating that police must have made a mistake. He again told her how sorry he was, and eventually Laura did begin to breathe a bit easier, and she wiped the tears from her eyes, and then she looked right at Rettig and said something that totally threw him for a loop. Laura told him that the police needed to arrest Sarah's soon-to-be ex-husband, Lorenzo, right away, because he was the one who had killed her. Rettig was used to victims' friends and families suggesting who they thought might have committed a murder, but it was Laura's complete confidence that just seemed strange to him. He told Laura that Sarah's husband, Lorenzo, would definitely be brought in for questioning, especially considering, it sounded like they were going through a divorce. Generally speaking, spouses and intimate partners were always the first suspects in murder cases like this. But Laura told him it wasn't just that they were getting a divorce. It was also that Sarah and Lorenzo were in the middle of this nasty custody battle over their child, and Laura said that Sarah was just plain terrified of Lorenzo. Laura told Rettig that Lorenzo had been living with his mother since he and Sarah had gotten separated. But one time, Lorenzo had shown up at Sarah's house and literally threatened to kill her. Sarah was so afraid that he would come back to hurt her and take their son far away from her that she kept a metal skillet under her bed as a weapon in case he ever showed up. Now, Rettig would obviously have to follow up on this claim. He had no idea if Laura was telling the truth or not, but it definitely seemed like Laura was being truthful, and he felt like he needed to act fast in case there was a chance that Lorenzo really was trying to leave town and take he and Sarah's son with him. And so Rettig asked Laura for her answering machine, that way police could study the message Sarah had left her. Laura said that was fine. She got up, unplugged the machine, and handed it to him, and then very quickly, he left her house with the machine and rushed out to his car. On his way back to the station, Rettig called in to ask for any records they had on Lorenzo Raris. And when he got back to his office, he found a file folder waiting for him on his desk. It would turn out Laura had been telling the truth. Sarah had called the police on her estranged husband, Lorenzo, a few months earlier, claiming he had threatened to kill her. Police had removed Lorenzo from the premises, and there was still a court order in place forbidding him from returning to Sarah's house. After reading this report, Rettig didn't waste any time. He requested a search warrant for Lorenzo's mom's house, Lorenzo's car, and for Lorenzo himself. This warrant would allow police to demand fingerprints and DNA samples from Lorenzo. Finally, Rettig sent 2 of his team members to Lorenzo's mother's house, where Lorenzo was living. They couldn't go into the house until the search warrant was granted, but Rettig wanted to have his eyes on Lorenzo, just in case he tried to make a run for it. By 10 a.m. on November 16th, so the day after Sarah's body was discovered, all of Detective Rettig's warrants had been approved. And so even though he had just worked through the night and he was starting to feel exhausted, he still gathered up several members of his team and they headed to Lorenzo's mom's house. At about the same time, Lorenzo stepped out of the house and got into his car to head to work. But before he could make it down the street, the 2 officers who'd already been there staking out the place pulled him over and told him to leave his car behind, and then they drove him to the police station. Rettig and his team arrived soon after that, and Rettig had Lorenzo's car impounded for a forensic search, and then they headed to Lorenzo's mother's house and they knocked on the front door. Lorenzo's mother, a small woman in her 60s named Amelia Raris, opened up the door. She was carrying Sarah and Lorenzo's young son in her arms, and she looked genuinely frightened. She didn't understand why there were police at her house. But very quickly, Rettig broke the news to her. He told her that unfortunately, her daughter-in-law, Sarah, had been killed the night before, and even though this is very abrupt and shocking for her, they did need to search her house and also ask her some questions. Amelia stared back at Rettig in total shock. She said that wasn't possible. Her son Lorenzo had just seen Sarah a couple of days ago to get their son. Rettig said he was terribly sorry, but this was the truth. And then he showed her the search warrant and said they really needed to come inside. Amelia nodded, still in shock, and led them inside. And then it was like she was on autopilot and just asked them if she could put the baby in his crib. Rettig said that was fine, and while Amelia sort of shuffled off, he instructed his team to do a thorough search of the house. A few minutes later, Amelia came back, still looking very confused and shocked, and she walked with Rettig into the kitchen. Rettig again apologized for the whole situation and for having barged into her home like this, but quickly asked her point blank if she knew where her son Lorenzo had been on the night Sarah had been murdered. She told Rettig she had had a late shift at the retirement home where she worked that night, so she didn't know. But her other son, Mike, would know where Lorenzo had been. And so Amelia called out for Mike. And suddenly, this man in his late 20s walked into the kitchen. It was Mike, and he looked just as frightened as his mother. He clearly had just been listening intently to Detective Rettig and Amelia have this conversation about Sarah being murdered. And so Rettig, who could tell Mike already knew what happened, he just asked the same question he had asked his mother. Did Mike know where Lorenzo had been on the night of Sarah's murder? Mike immediately stared down at the floor and just began shifting back and forth on his feet for a minute without saying anything. And then he looked up at Rettig and slowly nodded and said Lorenzo had actually been home that night. In fact, he and Lorenzo had hung out together that night for a little while before Mike had to leave for a night shift at his job. Rettig thought Mike seemed like he was hesitating as he was saying this, and so he couldn't tell if Mike was just nervous or scared or if he was trying to hide something. But either way, Rettig never put much stock in family-related alibis. Parents and siblings would often go to great lengths to protect a loved one, even if it meant lying to the police. And on top of that, even if this alibi were legitimate, Mike did not seem particularly clear on what time he actually left the house to go to that work shift. And so really, this alibi did not let Lorenzo off the hook at all. After that, Rettig joined his team and searched the house. Nothing really jumped out at them, no piece of evidence that made it clear Lorenzo could be a killer, but they were able to pull some fingerprints, and they collected a number of physical items that could be evidence that might help the investigation. Later that day, Detective Rettig returned to the police station and met with one of the investigators who had picked up Lorenzo. And this investigator told Rettig that there was something really strange about this whole thing. He said that when he and his partner met Lorenzo, one of the first things they told him was that his wife had been killed. And Lorenzo reacted by bending over and heaving and sobbing, but then when he stood back up again, it was clear he had not actually been crying at all. It was all an act. Now, Rettig didn't want to jump to conclusions here, but it was hard to deny that things were really lining up against Lorenzo. He was already an estranged husband in a heated custody battle who had previously threatened the victim, and now he seemed to be fake crying at the news of his wife's murder. The investigator told Rettig that Lorenzo was in an interview room, so Rettig grabbed a cup of coffee and headed that way. And after a few minutes of talking to Lorenzo, Rettig felt like his case was only getting stronger. The conversation they had was relatively short and to the point. Lorenzo said he was at his mother's house at the time Sarah had supposedly been killed, just like his brother Mike had said. Lorenzo also made it clear that despite all of the custody issues, he still cared about Sarah a lot, and he would never hurt her. But it was not Lorenzo's answers or his sort of flimsy family alibi that made Rettig feel like Lorenzo was now definitely his primary suspect. Instead, it was Lorenzo's attitude during this short interview. Rettig thought every answer this man gave him sounded smug and arrogant. And when he talked about his wife's death, he didn't show any emotion at all, despite the huge crying display he'd put on for the other investigators when they first told him about it. At the end of the interview, Rettig called in an officer to take Lorenzo's fingerprints and to swab his cheek for a DNA sample. After that, Rettig wanted to keep Lorenzo in custody, but he didn't have enough evidence to do that, so he had to let him go. But Rettig felt confident that it was only a matter of time before Lorenzo would be back at the station, back in police custody. On November 20th, so 6 days after Sarah's murder, her friends and family gathered at a local church for her funeral. And they were joined by people from the community who didn't even know Sarah, but who had followed her story closely on the local news day after day. Detective Rettig and members of his team also attended, and it struck Rettig that everyone who spoke at the service was so bright and positive when speaking about Sarah. Even though everybody was still in shock and heartbroken, they said Sarah had spent her life being happy and spreading joy, so they wanted to honor her by doing the same, even now at her funeral. But that was not the only thing about the funeral that stood out to Rettig. It was common for investigators to attend funerals of murder victims, specifically to watch how potential suspects might react. But Rettig couldn't really fully do that because his primary suspect wasn't even there. Lorenzo and his family had not shown up to Sarah's funeral. About a week after the funeral, Rettig was sitting at his desk going over notes from the search of Lorenzo's mother's house. Nothing had really come from the search so far, and he was starting to feel stuck. He was still waiting on DNA test results from the crime scene and Lorenzo's car, and without these results, or some clear evidence from the search, he still couldn't move in on Lorenzo, or anyone else for that matter. Just then, Rettig heard somebody call his name, and he looked up and he saw an excited officer flagging him down, telling him there was something he needed to hear right away. And so Rettig followed this officer down a hallway to a small room where a member of the investigative team was hunched over Laura's answering machine. This investigator had spent days trying to break down the voicemail recording of the breathing and the screaming and the crying into small sections to see if he could isolate anything that would help. The investigator, when they saw Rettig, waved him over and rewound the voicemail Sarah had left on the night of the murder and played it back. And when it reached a certain spot, the investigator stopped the message and looked at Rettig like he had just discovered something major. But Rettig just shook his head and said he wasn't really sure what he was supposed to have just heard. And so the investigator rewound the message again, played it, and then stopped it at that same point. And then did it a few more times, going back to the beginning, playing it and stopping it at that exact same spot. And eventually, Detective Rettig knew why the investigator was so excited. Because in the middle of all the screaming and the crying they had just listened to, Rettig thought he heard Sarah say one word, a name: Mike. Detective Rettig quickly dispatched 2 officers to pick up Lorenzo's younger brother, whose name was Mike, and they found him at his mother's house. Later that day, Rettig sat in an interview room across from Mike, just like he'd done with Lorenzo. But after only a few minutes of speaking to Mike, Rettig felt like these 2 brothers could not be more different. Where Lorenzo had come off as arrogant and uncaring, Mike seemed shy and sensitive. Talking about Sarah's murder clearly upset him. Rettig wondered if maybe Lorenzo, the older and seemingly more domineering of the brothers, had pushed Mike to maybe murder Sarah on his behalf. But Mike stuck to the same story he'd told Rettig when they met at the house. He said he had seen Lorenzo at home before he headed out to work. After the interview, Mike agreed to provide some DNA samples, and he also asked if someone could drive him to work, because he didn't want to be late. Rettig said he'd be happy to, and before long, he was driving Mike across town to his job. And as they drove, Rettig didn't push Mike too hard, but he did say he thought Mike knew more about the murder than he was letting on. Mike didn't respond. However, when Rettig dropped him off at work, Mike stepped out of the car and then fell to the ground and started vomiting. Rettig immediately got out and helped Mike stand back up and get him cleaned off. But as he watched Mike walk into work, Rettig now felt completely sure that Mike, and maybe even his mom Amelia, were hiding information about Lorenzo. As 1998 approached its end, Detective Rettig still felt sure he knew who the killer was. Either Lorenzo had done it himself, or he had gotten someone to do it for him, most likely his younger brother Mike. But before New Year's, the detective got the DNA results he'd been waiting for, and nothing from the crime scene matched Lorenzo or Mike's DNA. This shocked Rettig. He'd been so sure this case was just about closed. But without this scientific evidence, or any other real hard evidence to back him up, he couldn't do anything. So Rettig started to question his own theories about the case. Had he been so locked in on Lorenzo and Mike that he'd ignored other evidence? He went back to the beginning and tried to see what he could have overlooked. And so he dug into Sarah's job at the NSA, thinking maybe the murder could have some connection to her role there. It did seem far-fetched, but if she was involved with sensitive intelligence reports, he at least wanted to look into that. Rettig reached out to a contact at the NSA, and they told him they would look into it. But within days, the NSA contacted Rettig to tell him there was nothing they could find about Sarah's murder that seemed even remotely connected to her work. The fact that Rettig had gone from feeling like he was close to bringing Sarah's killer to justice to feeling like he suddenly had nothing to go on started to weigh heavily on him. He began having trouble sleeping, and he also started seeing that horrific image of Sarah lying there in her house all the time. But no matter what avenue he pursued, nothing new turned up. And so now this case, which had seemed like a slam dunk, started to go cold. On a night in January of 1999, 2 months after Sarah's murder, a 19-year-old sat in his car in the parking lot of a Baltimore McDonald's. The teenager pulled a ski mask down over his face, grabbed a revolver from the passenger seat, and stepped out of the car. He quickly walked across the parking lot, stepped into the near-empty fast food restaurant, raised his gun, and started yelling for everyone who was in there to stay where they were and for the employee behind the counter to hand over all the money from the register. The employee began to panic and couldn't quite get the register open, and so his manager quickly rushed to the counter to help. At the same time, the manager told the teenager with the gun to please calm down and that he would get the money out of the register, just hold on. But the teenager kept waving his gun and yelling at the manager to hurry up. It was taking too long. The manager kept saying he was working on it, and then finally he opened up the register. At which point, the teenager with the gun lunged over the counter and began grabbing the money, but at the same time, the manager of the restaurant must have done something to spook the teen, because the teenager fired his gun and the bullet hit the manager. The employees and the few people in the restaurant began screaming as the teenager ran out of the restaurant with the little bit of money he had in his hand. But the cops were already swarming. On an afternoon in August of 1999, so 7 months after the fast food restaurant robbery and 9 months after Sarah's murder, an officer rushed over to Detective Reddig's desk and told him there was a phone call he had to take. Reddig went to the officer's desk and grabbed the phone, and a detective from nearby Baltimore County introduced himself. This Baltimore County detective said he was pretty sure Reddig had not heard about a Baltimore County McDonald's getting robbed at the beginning of the year. Reddig sort of laughed and said that he had not heard anything about that. The Baltimore County detective said it was the craziest thing, but the person who had robbed that McDonald's and actually shot the manager of that McDonald's was a 19-year-old kid named Ardale Tickles. This kid was in jail for the robbery and the shooting, and recently he'd begun bragging to other inmates that he knew everything about the murder that had been all over the TV, the one where the woman had been killed in Howard County, Sarah Raris. Detective Reddig felt a rush, and he almost didn't know what to say. He'd reached the point where he wasn't sure if he'd ever find any new evidence in Sarah's murder. Still, Reddig knew that inmates often bragged about murders they knew nothing about, especially if those murders had been all over the news for weeks, like Sarah's had. The other detective agreed with Reddig, but he said this was different. He was nearly positive that this kid, Ardale Tickles, had been giving away details of this murder that police had never released to the public. Reddig thanked the detective for the call and said he was heading that way right now. As he rushed out to his car, Reddig felt more optimistic than he had in months, and he thought he might finally find justice for Sarah. And after meeting with the young inmate, Ardale, Detective Reddig was sure Ardale was telling the truth. He did know things that only the killer, or someone who had at least spoken to the killer, would know. It would take a little more time for Reddig and his team to get the concrete evidence they needed, but almost exactly a year after the investigation began, they finally knew who had murdered Sarah Raris. Based on Ardale's interview, DNA testing, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what happened to Sarah on the night of November 14th, 1998. On that night, the killers sat in their car a few houses down from Sarah's. They slipped on a pair of leather gloves, checked the hunting knife sheathed on their hip, and stepped outside. The killer wore all black, and they moved quickly towards Sarah's house, being careful to stay out of the glow from the streetlights. They ran across Sarah's yard to a window near the front door, crouched down, and looked inside the house. From this spot, they could see Sarah sitting at her computer in the family room. The killer raised up their elbow and slammed it into the glass. The window shattered, and the killer unsheathed their knife, climbed through the broken window, making sure to avoid the shards of glass, and ran right towards Sarah. Sarah was already up on her feet, running towards the phone that was on an end table, but the killer grabbed Sarah and slammed the hunting knife into her back just as Sarah picked up the phone. The killer kept stabbing Sarah over and over as she desperately tried to dial 911. She didn't manage to do that, but did hit a special speed dial button on her phone that called her best friend Laura. The killer sliced Sarah's hand, and she and the phone fell to the floor. The killer crouched down and stabbed Sarah in the chest again and again until she was barely breathing, and then the killer slit her throat. Sarah died there on the floor, but the killer kept digging into her neck with the knife as they grew more and more crazed. They stabbed Sarah's chest again and then hacked away at her wrists. Finally, the killer saw all the blood on the floor and the walls, and they stood up and backed away from Sarah's body. They ran across the room, grabbed the VCR, and threw some VHS tapes on the floor before heading to the kitchen to throw open some drawers. The killer had wanted to make this look like a robbery, but even they knew this was a very weak attempt, and they didn't want to spend any more time in that house. So they ran back to the broken window, climbed through it, and sprinted across the yard and down the street to their car. And to their shock, the neighborhood still remained completely quiet. Nobody knew. The killer tossed the stolen VCR into the passenger seat, gunned the engine, and sped away from the secluded suburban neighborhood. The following day, they went into work at a retirement home and told the woman they worked with that the job was done. Ardale Tickles, the 19-year-old who robbed the McDonald's and shot the manager, also murdered Sarah. But Ardale had no personal connection to Sarah at all. He just happened to work at the retirement home with Sarah's mother-in-law, Amelia. And it turned out Amelia wanted Sarah dead. Amelia never thought Sarah was good enough for her son Lorenzo. She claimed Sarah was a loose woman and was having all these online relationships with other men. Now, even though there was absolutely no proof of this, Amelia still did not want Lorenzo to be with Sarah. And these feelings only got worse when Sarah and Lorenzo had a baby together. Amelia thought Sarah was a terrible mother, and so whenever Amelia would babysit, she would give Sarah all this unsolicited, extensive parenting advice. But Sarah often rejected her advice. And so Amelia felt disrespected and angry on top of detesting Sarah. And so when Sarah filed for divorce and tried to gain full custody of her grandson, Amelia decided Sarah had to die. Now, Amelia knew she could not carry out the murder herself, so she offered Ardale, the 19-year-old young man she worked with, $3,000 to murder Sarah for her, and Ardale accepted. And for several months after the murder, it looked like Amelia might actually get away with it. Detective Rettig had focused the bulk of his investigation on Amelia's sons, Lorenzo and his brother Mike. Rettig had never even considered Amelia a suspect. And when no concrete evidence against her son surfaced, Amelia believed investigators would just leave the family alone and go down some other path. But in early 1999, Ardale robbed the McDonald's and shot the manager, got caught, and while he was in jail, began bragging to other inmates about how he'd been involved in a highly publicized murder. When Rettig and detectives from Baltimore County interviewed Ardale, he admitted to killing Sarah. It didn't take long for them to connect Ardale and Amelia through their work, and they also eventually connected a bank withdrawal Amelia had made to the payment she'd given Ardale, and so it was clear she had arranged the murder. Police do not believe Lorenzo had any idea what his mother was doing, and although investigators were convinced Lorenzo's brother, Mike, knew more than he was letting on, it was never proven that he had any knowledge of what his mother had done. On top of that, the FBI later conducted a detailed analysis of that voicemail that had been left on Laura's answering machine, the voicemail that basically captured Sarah's murder, and they determined that the word Mike had not actually been said on the tape. It was just a sound that could have been mistaken for the name. And so as a result, the district attorney's office focused their case solely on Amelia and Ardale. Ardale pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility for parole as early as 2024. As for Amelia, she was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. One day in March of 2012, a 5-year-old girl named Maria sat on the floor of her kitchen in a city in northeast Brazil, eating an empada and watching her aunt cook some stew. An empada is very similar to the empanada in that it is a pie filled with meat, but the empada is the Brazilian version of that pie. Maria's family was actually known for their cooking, specifically their empadas. In fact, at this very moment, Maria's mother was out selling their famous empadas on street corners and in bars and local restaurants. Now, the family got by okay this way, but despite their notoriety around these empadas, they really wanted more. They wanted their family name to be respected, to be powerful. And so to try to make that happen, Maria's family basically worked 24/7. Not just on making empadas, but basically in looking for ways to kind of grow and expand the family name. In fact, while Maria was sitting on the kitchen floor, she could hear her father in the other room working. And the reason she knew he was working is because periodically she could hear him yell out with excitement. He was basically sitting there coming up with ideas of how he could make the family name even bigger and better. And when he had a good idea, he would shout out and be like, "Oh, I found it!" And in addition to constantly sort of brainstorming for ideas of how to become rich and powerful, Maria's father also was an author, and he was writing a book that he was convinced was going to be another thing that would kind of ratchet their family up the social hierarchy. But because Maria's mother and father and basically everybody in her family were so completely immersed in work all the time, it meant they didn't really pay much attention to her.
And so most of the time, Maria was just kind of on her own, usually playing in the kitchen or playing in the backyard. Just then, the front door opened and in walked Maria's mother, and she was grinning ear to ear. Not only because she now had an empty tray, meaning she had sold all her empadas, but also she had brought someone along that she was really excited to introduce to Maria. Maria's mom stepped all the way into the kitchen, and right behind her was this young woman. And Maria's mother pointed at this young woman and then gestured for Maria to come over and say hi. And she told Maria that this young woman wants to become her new nanny. And so you guys can play together all the time while me and your father are out doing our work. Maria stood up and gave a shy smile to the young woman, but she wasn't sold that this woman actually would become her nanny. Because in the past, there had been other women who had come by to be her nanny, and they didn't seem to last very long. And so Maria was not getting her hopes up. Still, Maria wanted to be friendly, so she walked over and, as a gesture of goodwill, she handed this woman her half-eaten empada. And the young woman took the empada and laughed and said, "Thank you." After that, Maria's mother told her to head on out back and go play by herself for a bit, while she and this new nanny hammered out the details of her new job. And she told Maria that as soon as they were done, the new nanny would come outside and join her and they could play together. And so Maria, who was always very obedient, did as she was told, and she headed out back and entertained herself. And the whole time, as she's just kicking rocks around and pulling grass up and just kind of doing what kids do, she kept looking back at the house, waiting for the nanny to come outside. But she didn't. And after a whole hour had passed by and still this new nanny had not come outside, Maria felt really bored. And so she went inside to go look for her. A month later, Maria was out in her backyard playing by herself like usual when she heard a commotion happening inside of her house. She looked over at the house and couldn't really tell what was going on, and then she heard the sound of her mother and her father and her aunt raising their voices like they were fighting with somebody, and then all of a sudden, these uniformed police officers came charging out the back door towards Maria. One of the officers came right up to her and asked her what her name was, and Maria was so scared, remember she's 5 years old here, that she didn't even know what to say, so she just stood there staring, being totally terrified. She had no idea what was going on. But, as these police officers would soon tell her, it would turn out her entire life was one big, horrific lie. Maria's father, George Silvera, was not actually her father, nor was Maria's mother, Isabel Silvera, her actual mother, nor was her aunt, Bruna Silva, actually her aunt. In reality, those three people were not related to Maria. They were instead members of a cult called the Cartel Sect. And all these three cult members cared about was impressing the members of the cult. When they thought about, making it big, their so-called family name becoming bigger and more powerful, that was all in relationship to the Cartel Sect. They wanted the members of this cult to look at them as the most powerful and important members of that cult. And the way they tried to do that was by performing the duties of this cult to the best of their abilities, better than anybody else in the cult. And so what did this cartel care about? Well, the literal purpose of the Cartel Sect was to eliminate women they deemed unclean in order to reduce and purify the world's population. And Maria's family, the mother, the father, and the aunt, had become very well versed at doing this. All those nannies that came around to see Maria, well, the reason they kept vanishing is because shortly after the mother, the father, and the aunt introduced them to Maria and said, "Oh, she's going to be your new nanny," they would shoo Maria out into the backyard, and then they would murder the nanny because this person had been deemed unclean. They would cut their throats and stab them to death. But that wasn't all. That wasn't enough cleansing. After they murdered these women, they would then butcher them and stuff the human meat into their famous empadas and sell them to the people in town. They literally were feeding people in this city human meat. But the cult and the cannibalism and the murders were not actually the biggest shock of this story. The biggest shock of the story is actually the real identity of little 5-year-old Maria. She was actually the daughter of the very first victim of the Cartel Sect. The mother, along with Maria 3.5 years earlier, when Maria was just 1.5 years, they had been lured to this very house where her mother was murdered right in front of Maria. And then after her mother was killed, they cooked her mother and fed pieces of the mother to Maria. And ever since, they had just kept Maria and treated her like she was a member of the family, basically turning her into an unwitting cannibal. The existence of the cult and their hideous murders were ultimately discovered after they used one of the credit cards of their victims sometime in the spring of 2012. That's when all the cops rushed into the backyard and confronted Maria. George, Isabel, and Bruna, Maria's fake family, were convicted of 3 murders, including the murder of Maria's real mother, and they are currently serving what amounts to life sentences in Brazil. Police believe the actual number of women that they murdered is as many as 8. As for Maria, according to recent news articles, she was reunited with distant family. Maria is not her real name, that is a pseudonym to protect her identity.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Take My Soul. On the afternoon of July 18, 1997, a man was driving down a road surrounded on both sides by trees in a rural part of Wisconsin called Douglas County. There were no other cars on the road, and so this guy was driving pretty fast. And as he rounded this bend in the road, something out the passenger side window on the side of the road in the grass caught his eye. He couldn't tell what it was, but it was a pretty big object, and after he drove right past it, he just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like, whatever it was, it just seemed out of place. And so for whatever reason, this man felt compelled to actually stop and go see what it was. And so he slowed down and parked on the shoulder, he got out, and began walking along the road back in the direction of this object. And as he got closer, he began to see this object again in the shoulder of the road, and it was sort of obscured by grass and other things, so he couldn't see what it was. But as he got closer, he saw the object was pretty big, and it was all white. And as he took a few more steps and got within maybe 20 or 30 feet, he finally got a better look at this object, and he just froze. Because the object was a man wearing all white, a white suit, a white belt, white shoes, all white, and he was laying on the side of the road, just totally motionless. And for a second, the driver thought, maybe this guy is sleeping, but after taking only a few more steps and getting a totally unobstructed view at this guy, he saw there was a gaping hole in this man's chest. He was obviously dead. And so the driver turned around, ran back to his car, sped to the nearest house, and called 911. The next morning, a Douglas County detective named Stephen Long was sitting at his desk looking at the photos of the dead man in white. This murder case was less than 24 hours old, but already this was one of the weirder cases that this detective had ever been assigned to. The victim had pretty much immediately been identified because he was carrying on his person his wallet, and in his wallet was his driver's license, and so they knew who he was. But the man in white's identity actually made the whole case more confusing, not less. The dead man was a 45-year-old millionaire named Mark Foster. Mark lived 3 hours away in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and had no discernible ties to Douglas County. And so the detective was thinking, what is this rich guy doing here, dressed head to toe, all in white, getting murdered on the side of some local random back road? But things only got more confusing from there. After the medical examiner did Mark's autopsy, he told Detective Long that he had discovered a note inside of Mark's shoe. And the note just said, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey, or a lookalike? I hope I'm okay." Now, nobody, including Detective Long, had any idea what this note meant. It was far too cryptic. But when they ran Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey's names through their database, the police discovered that both of those men, 1, existed, and 2, they lived in Minnesota, same as Mark Foster. And so naturally, Detective Long began to suspect that maybe those two men were connected in some way to Mark Foster. Maybe they were involved in his murder, or maybe they were actually his killer or killers. He didn't know, but it was his best lead. So Detective Long decided he would just have to go to Minneapolis to try to find out more. A few hours later, Detective Long parked his car at the Minneapolis police station, He got out and walked inside the building. Waiting for him inside was the local detective who Mark had already spoken to. And so after meeting this detective, the two of them went into an interview room where Mark Foster's wife was waiting for them. And right away, Detective Long noticed that she was very pregnant and at least 15 or 20 years younger than Mark. But despite that, she seemed very composed. It would turn out she had already been told about her husband's death, and she was basically resigned to the fact that she was here to try to answer questions to figure out what happened. And so the detective sat down and they began to interview her. And then when they brought up the note that was found in Mark's shoe, specifically when they said the two names that were on that note, Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, when they said that, it triggered something in Mark Foster's wife. She immediately began to cry. And then in between sobs, she would tell the detectives that she knew who those two men were. She told them that she had previously had relationships with both of them before marrying Mark. And she said after she married Mark, Jack and Jimmy became very jealous. They didn't like the idea that she had chosen Mark over them. And so she had always felt like those two, Jack and Jimmy, sort of had it out for Mark as a result of this romantic rivalry. After the interview with Mark's wife ended, Detective Long began to think that, despite this case appearing on the surface to be very odd and confusing, that perhaps in reality, it was quite simple. Maybe Jimmy and Jack were so jealous of Mark that they killed Mark. I mean, based on what Mark's wife had just told them in the interview about them being romantic rivals of Mark, and also the fact that that note was in Mark's shoe and named those two men, it certainly seemed very possible. But over the next couple of days that Detective Long began digging into this theory, that theory fell apart. Because it would turn out Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey had absolutely airtight alibis. They simply couldn't have been the killers. Now, Detective Long was obviously frustrated. He felt like he really had it here, but he was not deterred. He decided his next move would be to try to better understand his victim. To this point, he had already interviewed a lot of Mark's friends and family, but something he had not done yet was simply go to Mark's house and have a look around. So Detective Long got a search warrant, and on July 29th, roughly a week after Mark was killed, Detective Long, along with another detective, pulled up in front of Mark Foster's large 2-story home in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Now, from the outside, the home looked totally ordinary relative to its neighbors. But once they got inside the house, it was anything but. The detectives made their way up to the front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, Mark Foster's wife opened up the door and let them inside. And right away, Detective Long is looking around, and he's seeing all over the walls on the first floor of the house are these graphic pictures and paintings of naked people. And then in addition to that, on some of the coffee tables and various surfaces on the first floor, right when you walk in, are all these pornographic magazines and books everywhere. And Mark's wife didn't acknowledge any of it. She acted like it was completely normal to have all this stuff right in the front part of your house. And so the two detectives are looking at each other as, Mark's wife is leading them on this tour through the first floor. And at some point, Detective Long just said, "Hey, Mrs. Foster, why don't you have a seat on the couch and you just let us take a look around your house on our own?" And so she said, okay. She sat down on the couch, and then the two detectives, they left the living room, went back to the front of the house, and made their way upstairs. And once they got upstairs, they found the master suite, and there was all this bondage gear inside. There were leather straps attached to the bedposts, there was whips and handcuffs, there was also additional pornographic material in there. But, considering what the detectives had seen downstairs, this sort of felt on par for this house. And so after searching the other bedrooms and other rooms on the second floor and finding more pornographic material basically everywhere, the detectives found their way back to the hallway in the second floor, and they noticed there was a rope hanging down from the ceiling, and it was attached to the pull door that led to the attic. And so the two detectives, they walked over, they pulled the rope down, it revealed this fold-out set of stairs that came down from the attic, and once those were in place, the two detectives began climbing up. And once they got up there, they discovered that this attic was not a storage space like many attics are in American homes. Instead, this attic was a fully functional room that sort of resembled like a satanic dungeon of sorts. All the walls were totally jet black, and there were all these burned out candles all over the place and tarot cards littering the floor. And on the back of the attic, basically all the way on the other side, there was what appeared to be an altar that sort of overlooked the entire room. And on the altar were more candles, and there was a voodoo doll. It's totally creepy, and the two detectives are looking at each other like, what's going on here? And so the detectives, they climbed all the way into the attic and then slowly began walking across towards the altar. And when they got close enough to actually see the altar up close, they just froze. Because sitting on the altar, in addition to the candles and the voodoo doll, were 2 business cards. Their own business cards. Detective Long and his partner immediately went downstairs and confronted Mark's wife about the attic. Like, what's going on up there? Why are our business cards on your altar? But Mark's wife, the second that attic was mentioned, went silent. She refused to speak about anything to do with the attic. And so after a minute, realizing this conversation was going nowhere, Detective Long and his partner called for backup. And as they waited for backup, the 2 of them stepped away from Mark's wife and began speculating, like, is this a cult? Was Mark a part of a cult that ran it out of his attic? Like, what's going on here? And are we being targeted by the cult? Is that why our names are on the altar? A few minutes later, backup arrived, and they would do a much more extensive search of the property. But other than finding more pornographic materials and, bondage gear, there really wasn't anything else substantive that connected Mark or his wife to what happened to Mark, or what Mark was even doing in this house. Was he in a cult? They didn't know. And so ultimately, Detective Long and his partner told Mark's wife, who still is being quiet at this point, that she should not leave town because they were going to follow up with her soon. Now, in fairness, Detective Long couldn't tell if Mark's wife was being silent and not talking about what was going on in her house because, she was complicit in some way in what happened to Mark, or if she was maybe being threatened by somebody and she was afraid to talk. They didn't know. But either way, after leaving the property after the search was over, Detective Long and his partner felt like their next move was to try to learn more about cults. They needed a cult expert. And it just so happened there was an occult bookstore very close to Mark's house. And so they decided they would start there. And right away, their decision to go to that bookstore paid dividends, but not how the detectives expected. It would turn out the owner of that bookstore was indeed a cult expert. But much more importantly, and relevant to this case, was that the owner happened to personally know Mark Foster. And he told the detectives that Mark came to his bookstore all the time, and also the owner said he knew a bunch of Mark's friends. And so by the time the detectives left the bookstore, they had learned a little bit about cults, but more importantly, they left with a list of names the owner had given them of known associates of Mark Foster who maybe were involved in whatever was going on in Mark's house. And so maybe they had information about what happened to Mark. The detectives were able to track down everybody on this list very quickly, and they were all young people in their 20s. And in each of the interviews they conducted, each of these young people were very open about being in what they called a religious group that they said Mark was a part of as well. Now, the detectives theorized that this religious group was very likely a cult, like they believed, but they didn't call it a cult, they called it a group. But the detectives didn't let up. They kept pressing these people until eventually a new name surfaced, Greg Freisner. Now, none of these people said Greg was in charge of the cult. Instead, they just sort of said, well, talk to Greg if you want more information about our group. The detectives naturally began to wonder if this Greg person was the cult leader, or maybe he was Mark's killer, or maybe he was both. But regardless, it seemed pretty apparent that they needed to talk to Greg because he might have more information about what happened to Mark. It took a few days, but the detectives were able to track Greg down and they brought him in for an interview. And boy, oh boy, did Greg have a story to tell. Based on what Greg told the detectives, here is what happened to Mark on the day that he died, on July 18th, 1997. On that day, Greg Freisner met Mark Foster at Mark's home. And when Mark came outside, he was dressed head to toe in white, something he would do for special ceremonies. And so Mark, he came down the steps, didn't say a word to Greg. They went to Greg's car. Greg hopped in the driver's seat, and Mark climbed into the back seat. And before long, they took off and began driving northeast. And for hours, these two just drove in total silence. Mark just stared out the window, and Greg focused on driving. The only thing that happened during this multi-hour-long drive was at some point Mark pulled out a piece of paper from his coat pocket and he wrote something on it, and then after staring at it, he kind of smiled and tucked it into his shoe. And then a little bit later, Greg pulled over on the side of the road in Douglas County, Wisconsin, on this random backcountry road. And as soon as they pulled over, again without saying anything, Greg and Mark got out of the car and they went around to the back of the car where the trunk was. And the two men are kind of stretching, it's been a long drive, taking in the scenery. And then before long, Greg pops open the trunk. And in the trunk is a rifle. Neither men have any strong reaction to this. Greg just reaches down, pulls the rifle out, and Mark, calm as can be, just begins walking over to the side of the road, to the shoulder. And then once he got to the shoulder, Greg came over and stood right in front of him and just looked intently into Mark's eyes, looking for the signal. And at some point, after Mark kind of composed himself, he nodded at Greg. At which point Greg raised that rifle, placed the barrel directly on Mark's chest, and fired. Mark crumpled to the ground, and he laid there for a second just moaning horribly, and Greg just stood over him watching until finally Mark went silent and died, at which point Greg casually went back to his car, got inside, and drove home. The only time he stopped was to throw his rifle into a nearby river. But once Greg got home, he was overjoyed because he knew the sacred ritual he had just carried out with Mark had been a total success. It had gone exactly to plan. It would turn out Mark Foster was absolutely a member of that religious group, the cult, if you will. Except he was not just a member. He was the cult's leader. And Mark is the one who orchestrated his own death. However, Mark did not view his death as him actually dying. Quite the opposite.
We celebrate life as we celebrate death. Death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is a great crossroads, a change in attitude, a change in longitude, a change in the way that we perceive our spirit. When we reach that portal, they'll ring some golden bells.
He believed that what he and Greg, his most devout follower, were going to do, this sacred ritual, was after Greg fires the shot into his chest and ends this body's life, that his soul, his consciousness, and his power will be transferred into Greg. Basically, his soul will go into Greg. And Mark believed once this transfer happened, that basically he would be immortal, that his soul would never die. It would stay in Greg and then maybe at some point get transferred to somebody else, but basically he would be here forever. The bizarre note that was found in Mark's shoe, the note that he wrote and stuffed in there, that note was designed to throw police off the trail. He knew that he was having Greg murder him, again for this ritual, but he wanted to make sure Greg didn't get caught. And so he wrote on the note very specifically Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey. Those two people he hated. He hated that they had been in past relationships with his wife, and they hated him, and so he figured if he was going to create a scapegoat for his murder, who better than his romantic rivals? They had nothing to do with it. He just named them in that cryptic note to get them in trouble. As for all the pornography and bondage gear that was found inside of Mark's home, well, that all played a role in Mark's cult as well. He was a firm believer that the more sex he had with his followers, often multiple followers at the same time, the more powerful he would become. As for the detective's business cards found on the altar up in the attic, those were very likely placed there by followers of Mark, so members of the cult, in an effort to potentially, thwart their efforts to solve the case. They might have believed that by placing those on there and performing various rituals, that somehow would prevent them from solving the case. We don't know for sure. That's the theory around why they were there, but obviously that didn't work. Greg Freisner would ultimately be found guilty for playing a role in Mark's death. He obviously was the triggerman, and so he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As for Mark's wife, although she definitely knew about the cult and may have been a participant, there was never any evidence that actually connected her to Mark's murder, and so she was never charged with any crime. One afternoon in 2009, a 38-year-old man was sitting inside of a manga cafe in Seoul, South Korea. So a manga cafe is a lot like a normal cafe.
You can go inside and buy snacks or drinks and socialize, do whatever. But also, in manga cafes like this one, they have these big in-store libraries that contain manga. And manga are like comic books. Now, this man did not have a lot of money. And so when he went inside of this cafe, he didn't buy any drinks or food. He just went up to the in-store library, grabbed an edition of his favorite manga series, and just sat down and began to read. Now, this man had read this particular series multiple times. He just kept coming back to it because he thought it was like the best manga you could possibly read. Now, a lot of people actually didn't know what to make of this particular series. It was actually kind of controversial because it was so over-the-top violent, like well beyond any other series. But to this man, that sort of made it stand out. It made it sort of special, and he loved it. In fact, it was so crazy, this series, that every time he read it, it allowed him to sort of leave his life for a second and just totally escape into this wild, violent story. And right now, in this man's life, he really needed that escape, because his real life was pretty terrible. He had spent practically his whole life studying and working to try to become a professional writer and director. But in Seoul, the entertainment industry was pretty unpredictable. And so this man had successfully landed a couple of jobs here and there, doing some writing and, doing some directing, but they were small gigs and they typically fizzled out at some point. And so over and over again, like right now in this man's life, he found himself back in the same position he always was in, which was unemployed. At the moment, this man lived with his mother and his grandmother. But even though all three of them were pooling their resources, they still struggled to just pay for rent. In fact, recently, the man had to sell his laptop, the thing he used for all of his writing. It was like how he was going to eventually crack a career in entertainment for real. He had to sell that just so that they wouldn't get evicted. And if that wasn't bad enough, the man had also begun taking out all these short-term loans with high interest rates just to pay for basic needs. Forget rent, like just food and basic necessities he was taking out loans for, but he had no way to pay them back. And so the debt was just piling up nonstop. And so for this man, the stress was like unbearable. And the only way he could find to even begin to cope with it was to escape into his manga books. And even though he knew that didn't solve his problems, he didn't care. It was like, life is so bad, at least briefly, I can read manga and escape. And so that's what he was doing today. And so he took his favorite manga booth, he sat back inside of the booth, and just allowed himself to get sucked into the story for the 20th time. He's read this thing multiple times. And so as he was reading this manga book, he suddenly has this epiphany. Now, this man all the time came up with various story ideas that maybe he could write and would be the next big thing for him. But for some reason, it was like, wait a minute. What if I write a story that's sort of, loosely based or at least inspired by my favorite piece of writing, this manga series? Like, wait a minute, I think I have a really good idea that sort of transcends any other idea I've ever had. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized there were other elements of his life that he could sort of attach to this story that's sort of beginning with this concept that came from this manga series. And so before long, he had put the manga book aside, got a pen and some paper, and just began writing down some ideas, general ideas for this new story he was gonna try to write. And for hours and hours, he sat in the booth just writing like crazy. And by the time the cafe was closing, he had this amazing outline of a whole world, this whole story he was gonna write. And he just knew this was the one. This was the thing that was gonna break him out of poverty and officially make him a successful writer. Several months later, this man had transformed that amazing outline into a fully realized project. And then he went out to try to sell it. And he's thinking, everybody's gonna want this thing. This is like an iconic, unique piece of IP. People are gonna be clamoring to buy this. But what he found very quickly is every buyer he went to hated it. They told him, this is simply too weird and way too violent. Like, this is well beyond what's reasonable. This is not something anybody's gonna want. Like, you will not have an audience for this. And the man was sort of crushed, because to him, it was so clear, this is an amazing idea. This story is so good. People that have experienced real poverty, who understand the lengths that people will go to make money when they are desperate, they'll relate to this. Like, there's a huge audience for this. But the buyers, they didn't see it that way. And so for the next 10 years, this guy kept trying to sell this story. I mean, he really genuinely believed in it, and he figured someone's gonna take a chance on this. They have to. It's too good. But for 10 years, everybody just kept saying, no, it's not good enough. No one wants this. But then, sort of out of left field, 10 years later, a major production studio actually said, you know what? This looks pretty good. We will buy it. This man's story was converted into a TV show, and it premiered in 2021, 12 years after the man originally conceptualized of the story inside of that manga cafe. And when this TV show aired, it was basically a global phenomenon overnight. It became the most talked about show anywhere in every corner of the internet pretty much immediately. It also made the production company that bought this story $900 million. And the man who actually wrote this story, he also got paid very well, and he won an Emmy. The manga series that this man read that sort of inspired all of this to happen was called Battle Royale. And in this series, these students are forced to fight to the death by a fascist government. And so what this man did is he combined that concept, fighting to the death, with something that he himself was dealing with in his own life, which was poverty. And he knew firsthand, the lengths he was willing to go just to make a little bit of money to make ends meet. And he knew other people who, were dealing with poverty were also sort of desperate. And they would go to great lengths just to make ends meet. And he said, okay, let's marry those two concepts. Poor people who were fighting to the death for money. The writer's name was Hwang Dong-hyuk, and the name of this TV series was Squid Game. One day in the summer of 1953, a 30-year-old man named Sam Phillips was cleaning up his recording studio, which was located in a fast-growing city known for their vibrant music scene. Sam had just finished recording a church choir, and now he was getting ready for his next client. And so he was resetting all the equipment and cleaning up. But Sam didn't actually know who his next client would be or when they'd show up. Because Sam's recording studio was pretty unique. Because he was always on the hunt for new talent to sign, he had opened up his studio to anybody who wanted to come in at any time. All they had to do was show up, give him $4, and they could be recorded professionally. This did mean that a lot of times his clients were not very talented, but he felt like it gave him the biggest opportunity to cast the widest net to potentially find his next big star. So that day, Sam finished cleaning up the studio and resetting everything, and then Sam just sat down and waited, hoping that, another client would come through the door. And eventually, another client did. This young kid, he was 18 years old, he came strolling inside, he had a guitar slung over his shoulder. Sam had never seen him before, and right away he could tell the kid was pretty shy. And the guy came up to him and he just said, hey, I work as a truck driver, but I love to sing, I love to play the guitar as a hobby, and I just wanted to come in here and, record a couple of ballads for my mom. And so Sam, again, he took all kinds. He's like, absolutely, give me $4 and we can record these ballads. And so the kid handed over $4 and he went into the booth, and Sam's like, all right, you're on. And Sam basically expected this kid to do what most other clients of his did, which was, they'd begin playing and be sort of like not that good at their instrument, and they'd sing off key, and, Sam just kind of sitting there listening to this terrible music, just waiting for it to end. But with this kid, it was different. Once he began strumming his guitar and singing, it was like he totally broke out of his shell. I mean, he was, at first glance, a very shy, sort of reserved guy, but in the booth, he was electric. He was amazing. And so Sam sat there listening to this kid record his ballads and was just so blown away by how talented he was. And then when it was all done, the kid said thank you. He took his recordings with him and he left. And then once he was gone, Sam just made a point to make a note about this kid that just said, good ballad singer, save. Basically, remember this guy because I think he's going to be something special. About a year later, in 1954, Sam was back in his recording studio and he was working with another client. It was this band and they were trying to record some songs. But as they were playing, they decided that they were really lacking another vocalist to round out the sound. And so they asked Sam, like, hey, do you know anybody? Sam's studio manager, who was in the room and overheard the request, immediately chimed in and said, hey, Sam, what about that 18-year-old ballad singer from last year? He was great. Maybe he could be the vocalist. And so Sam was like, yeah, I'll give him a call. So he called this young man and he was like, yeah, I'll jump in there and record some vocals. That'd be great. So the young kid, the truck driving, beautiful ballad singing kid came back to the studio. He hopped in the booth with this band and they began playing together and they sounded terrible. Now, the young man was still very much a great singer. Like Sam could clearly hear his voice cutting through all the noise, but it was like the kid and the band had no chemistry. I mean, they just met each other, so it's not that surprising.
And the music that the band was trying to play just didn't really line up well with this kid's vocals, and so it just wasn't working. And so Sam clearly could see that. He couldn't really tell if the band or this kid could see that, and so he said, "Hey guys, for right now, just take a quick break." And so Sam ended the recording, and the band and the kid, they left to go get a drink, and Sam left the booth and went into the control room, which is basically right next door, but does not have a line of sight into the booth. And he was just in there to sort of collect his thoughts and just kind of reset for a second. But then at some point, he hears the sound of music being played back in the booth where he'd just come from. Except the music was different. It was really upbeat, it was fast, it was loud, and Sam could clearly hear the sound of that kid, the truck driver, the amazing ballad singer. He was just going to town, like he was singing at the top of his lungs, and it just really sounded like something was going on in there. And so Sam left the control room, ran into the booth, and he goes in there, and when he got in there, he saw the band and this kid just totally rocking out. It was like they suddenly had amazing chemistry. The kid, the truck driver, the amazing ballad singer is jumping all over the booth. I mean, he's totally into the song. And the band very clearly was sort of following the kid's lead. They were basically playing music to match the kid's energy. And Sam is watching this and listening to this, and he's thinking, I have never heard music sound like this before. Like, this is a new type of music that I'm witnessing. I mean, it gave him goosebumps. He couldn't believe it. Like, this is a brand new thing. The sound was sort of a cross between blues and rock and roll. It was a little bit too fast for blues and too slow for rock and roll, but it was something really unique. And all Sam could think as he's watching this happen and as he's listening to this is the kid, the truck driver, the ballad singer. He's the star. It's so obvious. Like, this is coming into being because of him. That's the person I've been looking for. That's the star that I've been trying to sign ever since I started this recording studio. And so that very night, Sam and this band helped the kid record his first ever single, which was called That's All Right. And once that song hit the airwaves, that kid did become a star, practically overnight. He catapulted into music fame that few ever achieve. He literally would become one of the most famous musicians to have ever lived. Sam's studio was called Sun Records, and it was located in Memphis, Tennessee. And the young kid, the truck driver who sang amazing ballads, was none other than Elvis Presley. On the evening of March 31st, 2012, a 40-year-old man named Justin was standing in the corner of a boxing ring inside of a convention center in Ottawa, Canada. He could hear the screams of hundreds of fans in the stands all around him, and he knew thousands more were watching him on TV. And Justin was pretty nervous, because this was not only the most important boxing match of his whole career, but it was also his very first boxing match of his career. His reputation and his future were riding on the outcome of this match, and Justin knew he was massively the underdog. Justin looked across the ring at the other corner, and he locked eyes just for a second with his opponent, whose name was Brass Knuckles Brazeau. He had served in the Canadian military, he had a black belt in karate, and he was notorious for packing an insanely strong punch. Hence the name Brass Knuckles Brazeau. And pretty much everybody who had been following this fight up to this point didn't just think, oh, Brass Knuckles is gonna beat Justin. No, the thought was Brass Knuckles is going to destroy Justin. And not just because Brass Knuckles has a reputation for a strong punch, but because Justin had a reputation for being totally soft and pampered and just not somebody at all that was viewed as being tough. I mean, the idea that he was even in the ring at all, about to, fight anyone, was a huge shock. I mean, Justin didn't seem like the type who could win any fight, let alone against this guy. And in fact, as soon as Justin had even entered the ring, the announcers, who were trying a little bit to stay neutral, couldn't help but begin making fun of Justin. They even quickly nicknamed him the Shiny Pony as soon as he came into the ring. Like, they couldn't even stop themselves from being like, who is this guy? Like, he's going up against Brass Knuckles. Like, there's no way he wins. But what nobody knew was that Shiny Pony had actually been training really hard for this match for months and months. And he felt like, despite what people thought of him, given the fact that he's nicknamed Shiny Pony here, despite his reputation, he felt inside like he was just as tough
as Brass Knuckles, and he did stand a chance here. So, when the bell rang for the first round, Shiny Pony got up and he charged across the ring and immediately just started swinging at Brass Knuckles. And none of them landed. Brass Knuckles avoided every punch and just managed to counter and destroy Justin pretty much immediately. I mean, he was pummeling the crap out of Shiny Pony, and the announcers are like, oh my god, he's getting mauled, but they knew it was coming. They were kind of laughing as they were saying it, and like Justin, he knows he's getting destroyed. He's not even trying to throw punches at this point. He's just trying to stay on his feet, and at some point, Brass Knuckles really squared him up and hit him right in the jaw with one of his famous right hooks, and Justin's like about to fall over, and right at that moment, the bell rings again, the round ends, and somehow, Shiny Pony's still on his feet, but barely, but he survived the round. And so Shiny Pony kind of stumbles his way back over to his corner, and Brass Knuckles very calmly and casually walks to his, barely affected by that round. And so for the next several seconds that the two men were sitting in their corners, Brass Knuckles is basically just relaxing until the next round starts. But over in Shiny Pony's corner, like the medic is working on his face because he's bleeding everywhere, and Justin's coach is telling him, oh, you gotta do this, you gotta do that. But for Justin, it was like he had gotten so smashed during this round he could barely even think. But despite all the noise and the chaos, all he could think in his head was, I can't give up. They think I'm that guy that's gonna get pummeled and beat, and no one's gonna ever let me live this down. I have to go into this next round with reckless abandon. I have to find a way to just stay in the fight. I have to go all in. And so the bell rang again, and Justin, the Shiny Pony, gets up, and again, he goes across the ring over to Brass Knuckles, except this time, when he starts throwing punches, they land. And surprisingly, it was like every single punch he threw, it was rocking back Brass Knuckles. He was taking hit after hit, and Justin knew, like, this is working, and Justin, like, he can't believe it. But he's just riding it out, like hitting him as hard as he can over and over. And the announcers, they don't even know what to make of it. Like the Shiny Pony is coming out here, being the Rumble Pony here, just destroying Brass Knuckles. And so when the bell finally rang after round 2, it was Brass Knuckles who was barely on his feet, stumbling back to his corner. And it was Shiny Pony, who was, winded, but totally fine. And he went back to his corner, and it was like everybody was in shock. Like, wait a minute, now it's 1-1? Like, this guy's supposed to be a coward, a weakling. Like, how did he do that? And so this time, in the few seconds between rounds 2 and 3, Shiny Pony is in his corner, and he's looking across the ring, and he's staring at Brass Knuckles. And Brass Knuckles was kind of like averting his gaze. He looked totally gassed. He looked scared. Like he couldn't believe he was potentially about to lose to the Shiny Pony. And for Justin the Shiny Pony, that was all the motivation he needed. He knew mentally he had an edge in his opponent. And so when that bell rang for the third round, Justin got up and he went over there to Brass Knuckles and just pummeled him. Just over and over, blasting him in the face, and eventually he struck Brass Knuckles in the nose hard enough that his nose kind of exploded and began bleeding everywhere, and the ref actually had to step in and separate them. And even though, both men actually were down to keep on fighting, the ref said, nope, this is too much, and he ended the fight. It was a technical knockout, and Shiny Pony had won. Now, as much as this victory was huge for Justin, the truth was, Justin was not trying to become a professional boxer or really be in the boxing world in any capacity. This was actually just a charity match. And, Brass Knuckles Brazeau also was not a professional boxer. These two had just simply come together to have this match in order to raise money for charity. But Justin had another goal. He knew that his reputation in Canada was of being this sort of soft, pampered, weak guy. And he thought, if I can just get in the ring with a really formidable opponent in Brass Knuckles Brazeau and hold my own and maybe even beat Brass Knuckles in this fight, even though it's for charity, if I can do that, that could potentially sway the public's opinion about me. He was hoping that this fight could basically transform his image and people would see him as, tough and a serious leader. And that is exactly what happened. After this fight, when he won the fight out of left field, nobody could believe it. It was like he was the talk of Canada for a little while there. They're like, oh, look, Justin the Shiny Pony is actually, a little more serious than we thought he was. He's a pretty tough guy. And so Justin would use that momentum from the fight to eventually land the one thing he wanted more than anything else. He would get elected as the Prime Minister of Canada. The Shiny Pony's full name was Justin Trudeau. Now, I know what you've all been wondering. Where the heck is Seagull Lung? And what's he up to this summer? Well, let me tell you. He has been very busy. He recently graduated from pilot school, and apparently he was so good that he not only graduated at the top of his class, but upon graduation, he was immediately asked to come back and be one of their top instructors. And so naturally, Lungy and all his swagger and coolness agreed, and immediately he became the best flight instructor in the world. And so naturally, given how closely Lungy's incredible trajectory mirrors a classic 1980s Hollywood blockbuster film, you know the one, we decided to officially make Lungy the commander of our 4th of July summer blockbuster collection. And since Lungy has always been my wingman, I decided this time he should have the limelight and I will be his wingman. But in all seriousness, we do have a brand new summer blockbuster collection that's coming out that has our new t-shirts, okay, right here, the one I was just wearing, and this one, you know, it's recognizing one of my favorite movies, you know the one, celebrating the 4th of July. We also have this nifty bucket hat. We have koozies, okay? Probably gonna get sued. I think there's a pretty good chance we get sued, and so don't know how long this stuff's gonna be online. But right now it is, and if you go to shopmrballin.com, you can get your amazing summer blockbuster Mr. Ballin merch, okay? Again, shopmrballin.com. Probably getting sued, probably getting taken down, so get on there as soon as you can, okay? Also, you might think that's the whole announcement, but it's not. I got something else for you. I'm gonna do a giveaway. I'm actually gonna be giving away this particular hat, okay? I'm gonna sign it right here on camera. And so all you have to do is sign up